Farmer Richard Holloway is shocked to find his family's land suddenly claimed by a greedy HOA. The farmer quickly gathers signed testimonies from neighbors to derail the council's devious schemes. Richard exposes the secret financial manipulations the HOA uses to legitimize the construction. The farmer spots suspicious money transfers, hinting at bribed officials speeding up the construction. Secret council memos hinted at a large-scale plot involving bribed officials. Bit by bit, he gathered evidence to corner the council. The impending court battle threatened to shake the entire county. Their confrontation would expose hidden dealings, putting not just the farm but the community's entire future on the line. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting stories just for you. The old dirt road was just as uneven as it had been many years ago, though the branches overhead seemed denser, and the wild grasses at the sides of the path appeared to have claimed more territory than before. A lone figure made his way along the winding route toward what had once been a peaceful orchard nestled on the outskirts of Fletcher County. The early evening sky fanned out in pale amber and dusty violet hues, casting long shadows across fields where countless fruit trees used to bloom. The traveler, who had spent time away on the other side of the country, noticed there were new metal gates and a tall fence where there had once been only a simple wooden boundary. He paused at the gate, recollecting childhood memories of simpler days when the orchard was known throughout the region for its sweet harvest. He had been gone for quite some time, dealing with family obligations and the complexities of life that had carried him away from these quiet lands. The orchard, originally owned by his grandfather, was supposed to remain in a state of natural splendor, protected by old legal covenants that had been put into place decades before. Returning now, he did not expect to find much of anything changed, aside from the inevitable advance of wild growth. Yet, as he moved past the new fence, a flicker of bright floodlights at the far end of the property caught his eye. At first, it appeared as though a construction site had been established. There were heavy vehicles lined up, scaffolding towering over what looked like the remains of the old barn, and large temporary structures occupying land that had once been thick with fruit trees. He felt a growing sense of disbelief as he moved nearer to the newly erected buildings. The orchard's name, Pinebrook Acres, had always evoked warm memories of harvest celebrations, family gatherings, and the subtle rustling of leaves under an autumn sky. Now, it seemed to have been transformed into something entirely different, leaving the land looking unrecognizable. Wooden beams, piles of bricks, and cement mixers were scattered around. Various signs bore the name of a development association, though the lettering was blurred in the dimming light. He scanned the scene, trying to understand how such a dramatic change could have happened without his knowledge or permission. Rounding a corner near the old barn's foundation, he noticed a tall steel structure that seemed to form the skeleton of what might eventually become a multi-story building. Sparks from welders illuminated the place in bursts. It dawned on him that, rather than a small improvement or innocuous development, there was a massive project in progress here. Part of him hesitated to confront anyone on site, another part of him demanded immediate explanations. He began searching for any sign of a caretaker or manager, though the only individuals in sight were laborers busy carrying materials under the glare of portable lamps. A short while later, he spotted a trailer near the far boundary of the property. Its makeshift wooden steps led to a door with a faded sign pinned crookedly across it. Approaching with caution, he noticed the sign indicated some kind of local community board that had sanctioned the construction. The door was locked, and there was no one around to grant entry. Through a window, he glimpsed scattered papers, blueprints, and official-looking stamps. A wave of unease rushed over him. The orchard had always been part of his family's legacy, and as far as he knew, no local board had the right to overhaul private land and erect a massive structure like this without clear consent. He realized he needed more information, possibly from county records or older documents that might shed light on how an association could have gained authority over Pinebrook Acres. He remembered reading in his grandfather's letters about long-standing disputes with a neighboring landowners group that called itself the Fletcher Cooperative Council. The letters had hinted that the council sometimes used questionable methods to expand its influence. At the time, those warnings had seemed dramatic. But standing among the unsettling outlines of commercial construction, he now sensed that perhaps the orchard had fallen victim to precisely that kind of expansionist maneuver. He retreated to the edge of the property, passing under an ancient oak tree whose thick trunk bore carved initials from decades past. Memories of carefree days flooded him, but the present reality crowded out nostalgia. The orchard was no longer the refuge he remembered. He resolved to search his grandfather's old files as soon as possible, certain that hidden among them would be references to legal protections for Pinebrook Acres. Darkness settled in fully, and the lights at the construction site glowed brighter. He decided there was nothing more he could do that evening, so he made his way to a small rental cabin near the county line, where he could plan his next steps. Sleep did not come easily, as his mind turned over countless possibilities. Perhaps the orchard had been sold without his knowledge, or perhaps the local board had exploited some obscure clause. Either way, the orchard's transformation was no accident. Early the next morning, he visited the county registrar's office. The building, a weathered structure with squeaky floors, contained rows of filing cabinets and shelves stacked with manila folders. He discovered to his dismay that there were records indicating a change in usage rights for Pinebrook Acres. The documentation alluded to a motion passed by the Fletcher Cooperative Council to approve a hospitality complex that included lodging, a spa, and a conference center. The permit described it in glowing terms, framing it as a community-enhancing project intended to bring jobs and revenue to the region. Nowhere did the records mention the name of the orchard's rightful owner, or the decades-old covenants meant to protect the land from large-scale development. He sifted through folder after folder, noticing that the signatures on some of these documents belonged to individuals whose reputation he recalled from local gossip. A particular name stood out: Francine Delgado, head of the Fletcher Cooperative Council. He remembered hearing that she possessed a knack for real estate deals and had clashed with the orchard's caretaker in the past. According to the papers, Delgado had gathered support from other council members, citing mismanagement of the orchard as grounds for repurposing the land. He grew more suspicious with each document he read. Paragraphs describing the orchard's state of disrepair clashed sharply with the care he knew his family had taken to preserve the property. Indeed, Pinebrook Acres was not a typical farm. His grandfather had planted rare heirloom varieties, saving seeds and maintaining the soil meticulously. Yet, in these official forms, the orchard was portrayed as abandoned, neglected, and riddled with overgrowth that demanded rezoning for public interest. The language felt deliberately crafted to pave the way for the demolition of whatever stood there before and to install an entirely new enterprise. He concluded that none of this was an accident. The orchard's quiet prestige and the potential for profitable tourism must have caught the eye of those who saw an opportunity for commercial gain. Next, he returned to the orchard itself, determined to gather photographic evidence of any wrongdoing he might spot. If the development was truly unauthorized, or at least in violation of environmental regulations, he wanted to document the extent of the damage. The sun was harsh that afternoon, revealing in stark detail the wide patches of earth that had been torn open for foundation work. Bulldozers had upended sections of carefully maintained topsoil, and huge trenches had been dug where water once ran through a gentle creek. Dust clouds lingered in the air, and the orchard's characteristic fragrance was masked by the stench of machinery and chemicals. He made his way toward the back side of the property, the place closest to the old creek. There, the earth had been churned up in preparation for a drainage system. He noticed plastic liners and metal culverts stacked in piles, presumably waiting to be installed. If the orchard was in an environmentally sensitive zone, which he suspected, such excavation could be illegal without stringent permits. He decided it would be prudent to speak with someone at the local environmental agency, though he suspected some infiltration by the Fletcher Cooperative Council might have fast-tracked questionable permits. While returning to the central construction area, he caught sight of an open trailer door, a different trailer from the one he had seen the previous night. Inside, an older man was hunched over a table covered in plans and diagrams, occasionally looking at a battered laptop screen. Sensing that this man might be a site manager or supervisor, he hovered by the entrance, glancing at the reams of paperwork scattered across the makeshift desk. He noticed references to project deadlines, supply shipments, and labor schedules. Multiple references to Fletcher Cooperative Council were scribbled in margins, along with line items for land acquisition costs. It reinforced the notion that the council viewed the orchard as little more than prime real estate. Although he was tempted to introduce himself and demand answers, he held back, wary of how quickly word might spread that the rightful heir was present and possibly preparing to challenge the entire project. He recalled that his grandfather had once told him about a time when local groups attempted to rezone part of the orchard. On that occasion, his grandfather had thwarted the plan by presenting a set of meticulously maintained maps and a special property deed containing ironclad legal protections. There had been a mention of a land trust arrangement that would automatically revert the orchard to protective status if certain conditions were violated. Perhaps those documents still existed, hidden away somewhere among old boxes left in a storage shed. He decided that if the orchard was indeed enveloped in this legal shield, the Fletcher Cooperative Council would have a difficult time defending its actions. The next step, therefore, was to locate that paperwork. He headed for the ancient storage shed on the southwestern corner of the orchard, situated a short distance from a cluster of tall pines. The structure seemed precarious, with a sagging roof and warped planks. Inside, he found wooden crates stacked alongside plastic bins, each one packed with items from decades past, rusted tools, faded journals, and jars of seeds carefully labeled by variety and year. Searching through piles of papers, he uncovered receipts from supply shops, old pictures of orchard workers celebrating harvest seasons, and letters to relatives detailing various orchard improvements. Hours passed as he flipped through crumbling notebooks and musty folders. In time, he discovered a small locked chest. The lock appeared old and corroded, but the chest itself was intact. With a bit of gentle force and some improvised tools, he managed to pry it open. Inside, he found a bound ledger with carefully written notes in his grandfather's hand. Pages were filled with orchard inventories, detailing the species and conditions of each type of fruit tree, water usage logs, and expansions of irrigation channels. Farther along, he noticed references to legal matters, listings of property lines, annotations about boundary disputes, and cryptic remarks about county regulations. One set of handwritten lines mentioned a land stewardship agreement that was renewed annually with the relevant state agency. It seemed to suggest that the orchard, recognized for its diverse heirloom stock, was subject to certain conservation statutes. Deeper in the ledger, he found references to an event from many years ago, describing how an outside group had tried to purchase a portion of the land under the guise of establishing a nature reserve. His grandfather had refused. The group, apparently linked to local developers, had attempted to manipulate county records to claim that part of Pinebrook Acres was essentially free for development. But in that instance, the orchard's caretaker had produced evidence of a trust that superseded any changes to county zoning laws. If that trust was still valid, and had been updated properly, then the recent construction might stand on shaky legal ground. He felt a surge of hope, but he also recognized that old documents alone might not suffice. A cunning group like the Fletcher Cooperative Council would likely have prepared a defense to counter even the most robust documentation. He concluded that he would need expert help, possibly in the form of a property attorney or an environmental law specialist, someone capable of untangling the web of regulations, permits, and rezoning manipulations that had allowed the orchard to be overrun by a large-scale hospitality project. Yet, a more immediate worry pressed upon him. He suspected that the orchard's water resources and soil integrity might already be compromised by the ongoing construction. If the site was indeed home to a fragile ecosystem, the damage could be catastrophic and irreversible. He decided to approach a local advocacy group for environmental conservation. These groups often kept detailed records of wetlands, protected habitats, and historically significant farmland. An alliance with such an organization might provide leverage against the council. It was a gamble, but it might also be the only way to halt construction quickly if serious violations were discovered. Late in the afternoon, he carefully packed the ledger, along with a few other documents, into a protective case. He wanted to keep them safe from prying eyes, or from any attempt by the developers to destroy evidence if they realized he was building a case against them. He had heard rumors that the council was not above intimidation tactics. Although those stories had never been substantiated, the orchard's current predicament made him wonder how far powerful individuals might go to ensure their project proceeded unhindered. He left the shed and walked once more through the orchard, remembering how the sun, in years past, filtered through the branches of the fruit trees in a dappled pattern, illuminating the pathways in gentle gold. Now, large expanses of what had been productive farmland were stripped bare, replaced by piles of raw materials. A sense of loss settled over him, tempered only by the realization that he had found potentially crucial documents. He also recalled the orchard's old caretaker, a man named Tobias Finch, who had been fiercely dedicated to preserving the land's integrity. Tobias had known every inch of the orchard and had worked closely with his grandfather. If Tobias was still around, he might hold vital pieces of information about the orchard's operational history and about any unresolved tensions with the council. The man had once lived in a small house near the orchard entrance, but that home appeared to have been demolished to accommodate new roads or parking spaces for the construction. No sign of Tobias's presence remained, and the caretaker's few personal belongings seemed to have been cleared away. As dusk approached, he realized that building a robust case required more than rummaging through the orchard. He would need to gather official records, speak with legal professionals, and possibly mobilize community support. Despite feeling overwhelmed, he knew that a thorough approach was the only option. His grandfather's notes hinted that there had been success in previous decades when others attempted a takeover. Perhaps the orchard was more legally fortified than it seemed at first glance, though the council's infiltration into county processes indicated the fight ahead would not be simple. He decided to head back to town, where he had set up a temporary working space in a modest motel suite. There, he could organize his findings and start contacting the individuals who might help unravel the orchard's tangled legal situation. In the darkening sky, a single hawk circled overhead, as if surveying the orchard's transformation. He gazed at it for a moment, reflecting on how nature carried on despite human interference. The orchard had once thrived under careful stewardship, but now it faced the stark reality of commercial exploitation. With a final glance at the half-completed structure rising from the ground, he left, determined to unearth every piece of evidence needed to challenge the Fletcher Cooperative Council. It crossed his mind that he would soon have to confront the council directly, whether in a formal hearing or by stirring local media interest. He recalled glimpses of news articles in the registrar's office that praised the council for bringing economic revitalization to neglected properties. The orchard, however, was never neglected. Perhaps that narrative had been deliberately crafted. The question remained, who else was complicit in spreading that story, and what could he do to dispel the falsehoods? He had to move swiftly, lest every trace of Pinebrook Acres' identity be buried under concrete before he could stop it. He continued on the dusty road away from the orchard as the sky shifted to deeper shades of blue, making mental notes of the day's discoveries. He did not know how the council had mustered enough documentation to appear legitimate, but he suspected some bending of the rules or even outright corruption. His only consolation was that the orchard had a history of prevailing against opportunists, thanks to the foresight and unwavering diligence of those who had nurtured it long ago. If the orchard's legacy was strong enough to survive decades of storms and attempts at hostile takeovers, he believed it could stand a chance now, provided he managed to honor and utilize the protections left behind by his grandfather. He rose the next morning with a sense of lingering unease, determined to make early progress on the steps he had identified. Clouds rolled across the sky in a pattern of shifting grays, hinting that the day might bring both figurative and literal storms. He organized a sequence of tasks to unravel how the Fletcher Cooperative Council had succeeded in claiming authority over Pinebrook Acres. At dawn, he headed into the quiet downtown district, aiming to visit the small law office of a local attorney whose name he had seen on a weathered billboard. He reasoned that someone practicing in property law for many years in Fletcher County might know the council's history, as well as the orchard's. Upon arrival, he found an older stone building with chipped paint around the doorframe. The interior was lined with dusty bookcases, each shelf crammed with ancient legal volumes and county codes. A single fan hummed in a corner, battling the stale heat. He spent over an hour sharing a summary of the orchard's predicament with the attorney, who listened attentively and occasionally flipped through dog-eared references in search of relevant statutes. The attorney showed mild surprise at the scale of the development project underway at Pinebrook Acres but did not appear shocked that the council had managed to push it through. According to notes scribbled in a large, leather-bound journal, the council had repeatedly found ways to influence rezoning decisions. Their efforts often began with framing properties as dilapidated or underutilized, then offering plans for community improvement. The orchard likely fell victim to this pattern, bolstered by a series of favorable votes that the council had garnered through well-placed allies on planning boards. The attorney recommended that the orchard's rightful owner compile every scrap of documentary proof he could find and cross-reference it with the county land use regulations in effect at the time of each orchard covenant renewal. The challenge, however, lay in the orchard's uniquely complicated history. Generations had passed since it was first claimed, which meant that the official lines of inheritance and the orchard's trust might require thorough genealogical and archival research to establish an unassailable position. The attorney noted that simply possessing an old ledger or stating that his grandfather once warded off a rezoning attempt might not be enough in the face of slick arguments from the council's legal team. If property descriptions were even slightly outdated or incomplete, the council might twist those technicalities to defend the new construction. He left that meeting armed with a stack of references and a sober realization of the hurdles he faced. Despite his frustration, he refused to let the orchard become just another lost cause. He ventured next to the county archives, a more imposing structure than the modest registrar's office he had visited before. Pale fluorescent lights flickered over rows of file cabinets and tall shelving units, all meticulously labeled with references to years, legislative sessions, and property classifications. Down a series of corridors, he finally found the section dedicated to farmland records and protective trusts. The archivist on duty was a patient individual who helped him locate thick binders detailing environmental ordinances and land grant stipulations. Hours trickled by as he pored over the items, noting mention after mention of special farmland designations. One older document referred to the orchard by its long-forgotten name, Willowcrest Farm, which, according to a scrawl on the margin, had been changed to Pinebrook Acres in the late 1960s. He also stumbled upon a reference to a wetland study carried out in that same decade, which indicated that a portion of the orchard's western boundary was adjacent to protected marshland. The study described how a small tributary fed into those wetlands, creating a habitat for rare plant species. None of these references ever suggested that the land was fair game for heavy construction. In fact, most pointed to the orchard being part of a preserved area for which any commercial development would require multiple levels of review. He wondered how the council had bypassed those stipulations. Perhaps the wetlands had not been listed as active in recent databases, or maybe an unscrupulous official had reclassified the land. He located partial records that showed the orchard had once been flagged for a thorough environmental review if any major structural changes were proposed. He felt certain that the current hotel-like project would qualify as such, but there was no sign the necessary public hearings or environmental impact statements had ever taken place. According to these older documents, the orchard was also recognized for its biodiversity, hosting pollinators critical to the region's broader ecosystem. The entire operation seemed tailored toward compliance with stringent regulations. To see it now ravaged by bulldozers and overshadowed by steel beams felt like a grim violation of everything his grandfather had worked to preserve. He placed copies of the most critical pages into a thick folder, feeling a complicated combination of optimism and alarm. On one hand, if these older studies and agreements were still valid, they might prove that the development was illegal or, at minimum, that it had skirted necessary reviews. On the other hand, the council's approval of the project might already be so enmeshed in local bureaucracy that reversing it could require a drawn-out battle in court. He reminded himself that time was not on his side, the structure was already rising. Any day of delay gave the developers a chance to push construction beyond a point of no return. Leaving the archives, he drove toward a small, unmarked road he remembered from years past. It led to a clearing where, long ago, his grandfather had kept a second shed filled with older orchard tools and genealogical records. His memories told him the path would be nearly impossible to spot from the main road, hidden behind tall grasses and a cluster of oak trees. Eventually, he found the overgrown entrance, turned onto the bumpy path, and came upon a dilapidated structure, its roof largely intact but the walls partly rotted. He recalled that this remote spot had once been a favorite place for quiet reflection among the orchard's caretakers. Stepping inside the shed, he discovered stacks of crates that looked as though they had not been touched for decades. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling rafters, and dust motes swirled in the warm, stuffy air. He rummaged through the crates, unearthing yellowed deeds, partial genealogical charts, and property tax records going back nearly a century. Many of these items bore the orchard's old name, though the references to Pinebrook Acres began appearing in later years. He paused at a water-stained cardboard box labeled Family Trust Records. Inside, he found elaborate references to a trust fund established not only to protect the orchard's farmland but also to maintain the biodiversity of the region. According to these documents, the orchard had been placed under a legal instrument that required unanimous consent of specific heirs for any major alteration to the property's use. In other words, no single entity, not even a local council, was supposed to override that consensus. He scanned through pages of dense legal language. Whoever had drafted these documents had meticulously accounted for generational transitions, ensuring that even distant relatives would have a say in the orchard's fate. The trust had apparently been updated over time, with each generation adding new stipulations or expansions. In one section, he noticed a note that referred to a genealogical chart meant to track living descendants. The orchard's caretaker had likely maintained that chart in conjunction with official county records. Possibly, the orchard's present owner was not the only beneficiary, and the trust might require that all living beneficiaries be notified before any reclassification of the land. This was exactly the kind of weapon he needed to challenge the council's assumption that they could do as they pleased. He carefully photographed each page with a small camera he carried, mindful of preserving the evidence. The text was a labyrinth of legal references, archaic phrases, and cross-citations to older property statutes. But the essence was clear enough: there were numerous conditions that had not been fulfilled by those who had orchestrated the current construction. If the orchard truly remained under trust protection, any permit or rezoning authorized by the county council might be invalid, unless every beneficiary had agreed to it. He left the shed, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. He decided to drive back into the main part of Fletcher County to track down anything he could find about the orchard's caretaker from earlier times, in case that individual had additional records. He recalled that a local historical society, a small volunteer-run organization, sometimes kept personal information about long-time residents. The society's headquarters was housed in a Victorian-era home near the courthouse. He arrived to find a modest, creaky foyer lined with black and white photographs of past county events. In glass displays, visitors could see old farm tools, newspaper clippings from local fairs, and genealogical scrapbooks donated by families who had once lived in Fletcher County. He explained to the volunteer on duty his interest in finding references to a caretaker named Tobias Finch, or any caretaker records for Pinebrook Acres or Willowcrest Farm. The volunteer handed him a binder labeled Local Residents, Biographical Files. It contained typed and handwritten entries for various individuals who had contributed to the county's history or been involved in notable events. Flipping through, he found 2 references to a person named Finch. The first entry described an individual who had served in the county's horticulture department decades ago, but the name did not match. The second entry referenced a Tobias Finch who had worked for multiple farms, including Willowcrest, as a supervisor of orchard operations. This entry was short, but it noted that Finch eventually retired to a neighboring county and was believed to have left behind detailed diaries about orchard care. He made a note to follow this lead, suspecting that Finch might have kept personal records that filled in gaps left by the official documents. The volunteer also recalled a rumor that Finch, or his descendants, might still hold a trunk of records relevant to the orchard's history. Even a single diary page detailing boundary markers or older expansions could prove invaluable. He thanked the volunteer, offering a modest donation to the Historical Society's upkeep, then left feeling that this fragment of information might help piece together a puzzle too large for any one person to solve without help. He decided to stop by the orchard itself again, if only to assess the pace of the construction. As he approached the property line, he saw that large sections of what once had been orchard rows now resembled a rough parking lot. The smell of fresh asphalt hung in the hot air. A cluster of workers milled around, operating machinery that smoothed the ground. Near the steel skeleton of the main building, insulation materials lay in stacks, indicating that the project had progressed to the stage of interior installation. He realized that halting the construction as soon as possible had become urgent. Every day, the structure inched closer to completion, and each new phase of building might reduce the likelihood that the council would consider reversing course. He parked a distance away to avoid drawing attention, then walked a perimeter around the orchard's edges. In one corner, he spotted signs of environmental disruption, shallow pools of water mixed with oil and runoff near the temporary drainage channels. He recalled the mention of wetlands in the archived studies, concluding that any contamination here could disrupt the fragile habitats connected to the orchard's water system. The more evidence he gathered of environmental harm, the stronger the eventual case against the council's compliance with required ecological safeguards. He felt a growing sense of anger at how easily the orchard's wildlife and waterways could be sacrificed in the name of community enhancement. His walk took him to a grove at the orchard's far edge, where the noise of construction machinery faded slightly. This portion of the land seemed mostly untouched, the fruit trees still standing. The light filtering through the leaves had a nostalgic softness, invoking memories of harvest days gone by. He paused to breathe in the orchard air, faintly scented with the remnants of wildflowers. Despite the damage inflicted elsewhere, this corner still encapsulated the orchard spirit, a living relic of the devotion his family had poured into maintaining healthy soil and vibrant tree stock. He considered the possibility of rallying local residents who might have fond memories of the orchard's harvest festivals or who had relied on its produce for seasonal jobs. If enough individuals spoke out, the council might be forced into public accountability. Yet, from what the attorney and others had implied, the council's leadership was adept at managing public perception through carefully worded statements and claims of bringing jobs to the region. People might be hesitant to oppose what appeared to be a lucrative development, especially if they believed it would provide construction contracts and future employment. He decided that the orchard's best chance was a comprehensive strategy, legal pressure, environmental scrutiny, and an appeal to the community's collective memory. Where one approach might fail, the combination could weaken the council's hold. The orchard's trust documents were a powerful asset, but they would carry more weight if supported by an environmental injunction or a wave of public outcry. As evening descended, he returned to his temporary quarters and spread out the materials he had gathered over 2 large tables. He categorized them into groups: older property deeds and genealogical charts, environmental ordinances and studies, official county records referencing Pinebrook Acres, and potential leads, such as contacting the caretaker's family or enlisting local journalists. The arrangement looked chaotic, yet he sensed a pattern emerging. Each piece of evidence undercut the council's portrayal of the orchard as a neglected, worthless stretch of land. A map from the archives showed the orchard's precise boundaries, with color-coded zones indicating topographical features. One of those zones, according to a key in the legend, was designated as a conservation buffer. Notes in the margin suggested that any development within 200 feet of that buffer required a full environmental impact statement. Yet, the skeletal structure of the council's hotel appeared to stand well within that margin, with no evidence that an impact statement had been submitted to the state. This alone might serve as grounds for an immediate halt to construction if he could present it effectively to the right agency. Sorting through the genealogical documents, he discovered partial references to multiple lines of inheritance. One line indicated a set of distant cousins living out of state, individuals who might also be partial beneficiaries of the Orchard Trust. If they had never been consulted regarding the orchard's repurposing, then the council's entire enterprise might be in violation of trust stipulations. Although tracking down these family members might be cumbersome, their existence could strengthen his claim. He made a note to contact a specialized environmental law group in the neighboring city, where attorneys occasionally took on pro bono work for cases with significant conservation implications. Next, he drafted a list of local media outlets, including smaller newspapers and radio stations that sometimes covered grassroots issues ignored by larger regional sources. He had no illusions that the orchard story alone would dominate headlines, but shining any amount of publicity on the council's questionable methods could force them to respond more carefully. Public scrutiny would also make it harder for them to bend or obscure regulations behind closed doors. Late that night, the weather shifted, and a rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, splattering against the motel window. He watched droplets streak down the glass as lightning flickered in the sky. The orchard likely needed the rain, though it could cause complications at the construction site. He considered driving out to Pinebrook Acres to see if the wet conditions exposed any further issues, such as inadequate drainage or soil erosion caused by hasty building practices. Exhaustion got the better of him, however, and he decided it would be more productive to rest, then set out early the following day with a fresh mind. Before lying down, he consolidated the orchard's trust documents in a secure folder and stowed them in a locked suitcase, well aware that if the council learned of his growing arsenal of evidence, they might attempt to confiscate or destroy it. He recalled the attorney's cautionary words about intimidation and sabotage, which the council had allegedly used in the past to silence opposition. He had already caught a glimpse of the lengths they would go to, considering how quickly and forcefully they had commenced construction. The orchard was a prize they would not surrender easily. Morning arrived with surprisingly clear skies, the storm having passed during the night. He set out toward the orchard, determined to see what the rain might have revealed. Pools of muddy water greeted him as he navigated the unpaved roads that wound around the construction site. Heavy tire tracks had turned the soil into messy ruts, and the scaffolding near the half-finished building glistened with leftover raindrops. From a vantage point at the edge of the orchard, he could see that portions of the temporary drainage system had overflowed, sending rivulets of brown water coursing across what used to be orchard rows. The site underscored how fragile the land had become under the stress of industrial-scale development. He took photos of the flooded areas, capturing images of soil erosion and the haphazard network of plastic pipes that diverted water in seemingly random directions. He noticed that no consistent erosion control measures had been put in place, a glaring oversight if the council had followed proper building protocols. The orchard's gentle slopes once allowed rainwater to filter naturally through tree roots and healthy soil. Now, bare earth and the unnatural channels carved by construction equipment caused severe runoff. He retreated to the orchard's intact corner, passing rows of surviving trees. Among them were centuries-old apple and plum varieties unique to the orchard's heritage. The gentle canopy overhead brought him a momentary sense of peace, but it also heightened his resolve. His grandfather's vision for the orchard had always been one of sustainability, not exploitation. Perhaps the orchard's unique biodiversity could be leveraged as an argument to preserve it. If certain rare cultivars existed nowhere else, their destruction might spark broader outrage among horticultural circles. He also considered contacting academic institutions with agriculture or horticulture departments that might conduct studies on rare plant varieties. Such institutions often jumped at the chance to protect genetically distinct strains. The orchard's reputation had once attracted the attention of researchers, maybe it could again. If enough experts weighed in, their testimonies could highlight the orchard's irreplaceable value. In combination with the environmental and legal angles, that scientific perspective might solidify the orchard's claim to protection. He decided his next move would be to assemble a formal complaint that he could submit to the appropriate state agencies, backed by the orchard's old documents and the fresh evidence of improper construction methods. He would copy the complaint to the local media outlets on his list, ensuring that if the council tried to stonewall him, the public might still learn about the orchard's plight. Speed was essential. With each passing hour, more cement would be poured, more beams would be set, and more of the orchard's essence would be destroyed. Driving back to the motel, he passed a series of billboard advertisements featuring bright images of new businesses coming to Fletcher County. He spotted one sign referencing Fletcher Cooperative Council, Progress for All, next to a photograph of a modern building and smiling workers. The superficial cheer of the advertisement rankled him. It seemed designed to mask the deeper reality of how the council achieved its so-called progress. He reminded himself that what he was doing was not a petty disagreement over land, it was a stand against the systematic disregard for heritage, biodiversity, and honest ownership. He spent the remainder of the day drafting the complaint. He meticulously cited the orchard's trust documents, the environmental studies, and the county's older zoning records, pointing out every discrepancy and apparent violation he could find. In stark language, he outlined how the council had fast-tracked a major hospitality project without the required public hearings or environmental assessments. He highlighted the orchard's special status under the trust and the orchard's genealogical legacy. He concluded by requesting an immediate halt to construction, pending a full investigation into the project's legality. Exhausted, he stepped outside and gazed over the distant skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. Though a sense of urgency pulsed through him, he recognized that progress might be slow. Government agencies moved at their own pace, and the council likely had friends in many offices who would be eager to delay any review process that might jeopardize the new development's momentum. This knowledge weighed on him, but he also felt a growing spark of conviction. The orchard was not just a personal inheritance, it represented years of careful stewardship, a living testament to a different way of life than the one championed by profit-driven developers. Early the following morning, he stopped by the post office, sending out multiple copies of the complaint via certified mail, addressed to state regulators, the County Planning Commission, and several environmental organizations. He also composed succinct letters to local newspapers, describing the orchard's predicament and hinting at the possibility of legal breaches that endangered more than just a single farm. Once these letters were out, there was no going back. The orchard's story would reach the public domain, and the council would almost certainly become aware of his challenge. Returning to his room, he glanced over the orchard's old photographs that he had pinned to a corkboard. Images of a thriving orchard in bloom, harvest festivals in full swing, and children playing among towering fruit trees offered a stark contrast to the current state of the land. Beneath those photos, printouts of the modern construction site showed trucks, cranes, and rows of cinder blocks. The visual dissonance was jarring. If everything went according to the council's plan, those images of a once lush orchard might soon be the only remaining record of what the land had been. A message came through on his phone, a generic notice from the County Planning Commission acknowledging receipt of his complaint. It indicated that his concerns would be reviewed. He recognized the noncommittal tone common in bureaucratic communications, but at least it was a first step. Later in the day, he received a polite acknowledgement from an environmental watchdog group, stating that they would consider sending someone to examine the orchard site. He held on to these small signs of progress, however tentative they might be. Still, he felt he needed someone on the inside of the council's operations, an individual who could confirm rumors or produce additional evidence of unscrupulous methods. While combing through the orchard's documents, he had noticed a mention of a former council member, a name that reappeared in multiple places. This individual might have parted ways with the council on bad terms, or perhaps had left under suspicious circumstances. If so, he or she might hold crucial insights about the council's strategies or the particular alliances that got Pinebrook Acres approved so quickly. He spent the afternoon trying to track down contact information for that former member, scouring local phone directories, online community listings, and public records. Eventually, he located a mailing address that seemed to match the name. In a leap of faith, he composed a letter detailing his situation and asking if the recipient had any knowledge of the council's internal dealings with farmland acquisitions. He included a phone number, hoping for some form of response. It was a slender thread, but in a case like this, even a slender thread could lead to a breakthrough. At dusk, weariness set in. He recognized that his daily attempts to juggle legal, environmental, genealogical, and investigative tasks had begun to drain him. Yet he had no choice but to continue. The orchard depended on it, and he felt an unbreakable obligation to safeguard not only a piece of land but also the legacy entwined with it. Folding up the trust documents for the night, he reflected on the orchard's original caretaker, who had defied earlier attempts at encroachment. That caretaker had succeeded by combining thorough documentation with unwavering determination. The orchard's present advocate had to match, if not exceed, that resolve. Though dawn was still hours away, he found himself awake, gazing at the ceiling and mentally outlining his next steps. He would attempt to reach the caretaker Finch's extended family for more records. He would also contact the state's Agricultural Extension Office to inquire about any archives of orchard disease management or soil conservation practices that might reference Pinebrook Acres. If the orchard's long-time sustainability methods were documented, they could further prove it was never the blighted property the council claimed. He considered visiting local produce markets and farm co-ops to see if any older vendors remembered buying harvests from the orchard, thereby cementing its reputation as a well-tended farm. Every bit of evidence could help. He also mulled over the possibility of a direct confrontation with council representatives. Perhaps it would occur at a public meeting, or perhaps the council would try to reach him privately to negotiate. He dreaded a scenario in which they might offer hush money or a partial settlement, ignoring the orchard's deeper value. He resolved not to be swayed by empty assurances or financial compensation. His grandfather's unwavering dedication to Pinebrook Acres had taught him that some legacies were beyond a price tag. So he greeted the sunrise and set out again, a binder of documents under one arm and a sense of cautious optimism fueling his steps. In the distance, thunderclouds threatened once more, perhaps an omen that trouble still loomed. But even if rain pummeled the orchard, it could not wash away the historic truths etched into its soil. A place as special as Pinebrook Acres deserved a thorough defense, and every clue he uncovered only convinced him further that a lawful victory was possible, even if the final cost would be measured in days, weeks, or months of draining struggle. He maneuvered back along the rural roads leading to the orchard, where the council's construction machines once again roared. The scene appeared more fraught than the day before. Clusters of workers rushed around, striving to address the washed-out trenches left by the rain. A short crane attempted to hoist massive panels into position, its mechanical clatter echoing across the property. With every passing hour, the skeletal frame drew closer to a finished shape. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, recognizing that time was growing short. If the orchard's guardians, both past and present, had placed their faith in the documents he now carried, then he would repay that trust by using those documents to strike at the heart of the council's ambitions. He parked at a safe distance, exiting the vehicle and taking a quick inventory of the site's changes. The orchard remained a battlefield between an unwavering natural heritage and the relentless push of commerce. Whether or not the orchard emerged unscathed would depend on how effectively he could align the orchard's storied past with modern legal frameworks designed to protect farmland, trusts, and ecological balance. Standing there, he felt the cumulative weight of history on his shoulders, but also the uplifting knowledge that people before him had faced attempts at encroachment and had prevailed. If they could do it, he told himself, perhaps Pinebrook Acres would triumph yet again. He studied the rapidly evolving site from afar, noticing that in addition to the main building skeleton, side structures had begun to take shape. Portable offices lined one edge of the grounds, and a row of large dumpsters indicated the volume of discarded debris and material packaging. From time to time, trucks arrived with more supplies, rumbling across fresh gravel that crunched under heavy wheels. He realized that if he hoped to stop the project before it became too entrenched, he would have to accelerate his own efforts. As soon as he finished his inspection, he drove to the county's Environmental Protection Bureau in search of direct action. He arrived at a small, boxy administrative building on the outskirts of Fletcher County's Civic Center. The corridor leading to the relevant department was lined with notices about invasive species alerts, well water testing schedules, and reminders about local recycling programs. One particular flyer caught his eye. It described the protective status of certain waterways in the region, specifying that any development near them required a thorough impact review. He carefully noted the brochure's reference number, intending to compare it later with the orchard's own drainage streams. He spent the next hour sifting through the Bureau's publicly accessible files, hunting for any record of an environmental impact statement related to the hospitality complex. The polite but reserved employee on duty explained that if a statement existed, it would be on file under County Code EIS-########, assigned at the time of permit submission. No such file turned up when they cross-checked references to Pinebrook Acres or the orchard's original name. From everything he could see, it seemed no official environmental review had ever been conducted. Although the county might have filed a brief note somewhere to claim it was unnecessary, that paperwork was also absent. It became clearer by the moment that the council had taken shortcuts to secure approvals without going through the legally mandated steps. He next visited a small lab in the same building where water samples from across the county were analyzed for contaminants. He intended to drop off a sample from the muddy runoff he had collected the previous day in a small jar. Although he was not sure if it would yield results demonstrating violations, heavy metals, pollutants, or excessive sedimentation, he thought it worth checking. Often, large construction sites introduced damaging byproducts into natural waterways. The technician in charge accepted the jar, providing a receipt and a promised timeframe of about a week to complete a basic analysis. If the orchard's water was indeed contaminated, the report could serve as another piece of evidence to underscore the council's disregard for ecological safeguards. Leaving the bureau, he drove to a local coffee shop where a handful of community members gathered daily to share gossip or pore over local newspapers. In a corner booth sat an elderly individual who occasionally contributed historical columns to the Fletcher County Weekly. He remembered reading that this local historian had once compiled stories about old farmland and the families who tended it. Taking a seat at a nearby table, he spent a few minutes arranging his approach. He did not want to divulge everything about the orchard's precarious situation, lest news travel too quickly to the council. Instead, he gently steered the conversation toward memories of farmland that had shaped the county, then casually brought up Pinebrook Acres. The historian recalled, with some fondness, that the orchard had been a source of pride for the region, especially in years when local produce markets thrived. Though the historian had not visited recently, the orchard's significance was clearly still lodged in the older resident's mind. He asked whether there had been any public mention of turning that orchard into commercial property years ago. The historian furrowed his brow in thought, explaining that he vaguely remembered talk of rezoning farmland in the area, possibly decades back, though it never seemed to go anywhere. He also recalled a caretaker who had fiercely guarded the orchard's boundaries, suggesting that attempts to intrude or reclassify it were invariably met with well-organized pushback. The caretaker's name was Finch, though the historian could not recall many details beyond that. He thanked the older man and quietly left, satisfied that at least within the community's older generation, memory of the orchard remained strong. He returned to his motel room, where he found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed note. The writer claimed to have worked under a senior member of the Fletcher Cooperative Council, hinting at knowledge of internal communications that could confirm underhanded tactics. The note was unsigned, but it included a phone number and a request to meet in a neutral place. The orchard's advocate felt a rush of cautious optimism. Although the note could be a trap, he could not ignore any chance to gain an inside perspective. He decided to leave a brief voicemail at the provided number, saying he was available for a conversation, then waited to see if it led to anything. That evening, he placed calls to the offices of 2 environmental law groups. One call went unanswered, but at the second number, he managed to leave a lengthy message detailing the orchard's special trust status, its ecological importance, and the suspicious nature of the development permits. He expressed his hope that the law group would consider advising or supporting his effort to halt the Fletcher Cooperative Council's project. With each retelling of the orchard's predicament, the complexities seemed to multiply in his mind. He recognized that, in addition to verifying the orchard's trust-based protections, a large-scale approach involving multiple stakeholders might be the only way to force the council's hand. The next few days unfolded in a blur of methodical activity. He routinely traveled to the orchard at sunrise, photographing any incremental changes, new construction materials, fresh disruptions to the soil, and continued alteration of the orchard's terrain. One morning, he noticed a fence being erected around the orchard's perimeter, bearing signs that read, "Authorized personnel only." Though the orchard had always had a boundary. The new barbed wire top added a menacing quality, serving as a barrier to anyone trying to record or assess the damage. It confirmed that the council likely suspected opposition was brewing, and this was a preventative measure. In response, he documented the fence's placement, noting spots where the orchard's original boundary lines were clearly being encroached upon. If the fence lay outside the orchard's correct perimeter, it constituted yet another violation of property rights. As the fence went up, he also noticed that the orchard's corner, the one still partly preserved, now had posted warnings about hazardous construction zones. The orchard's caretaker house, once so vibrant with life, had been demolished down to a few piles of debris. Machinery occasionally rumbled nearby, flattening or clearing stumps. He felt a pang of loss whenever he saw the orchard's historically significant corners reduced to rubble. It stoked the inner resolve he needed to keep pushing forward. He managed at last to reach an elderly woman named Esther who claimed to be a distant relative of Finch, the caretaker. Her voice over the phone was guarded, but she acknowledged having some old letters that might relate to Willowcrest Farm's disputes with local authorities. She seemed reluctant to share them, uncertain if it would drag her into a conflict, but after he explained the orchard's plight and Finch's deep devotion to its well-being, she agreed to let him examine the documents. They arranged to meet in a neighboring county's public library, a setting that felt safe and neutral. A couple of mornings later, he drove an hour through rolling terrain, passing farmland in varying states of upkeep until he reached the library's small parking lot. Inside, Esther was waiting by a table, her posture upright and her hands folded over a manila envelope. She was initially wary, but as they sat and spoke in low, measured tones, her reticence seemed to fade. She opened the envelope, revealing a modest collection of letters and copied pages from a worn notebook. The letters, written decades ago by Finch, mentioned boundary surveys, suspicious attempts by local groups to alter survey lines, and frequent visits to the county clerk's office to re-verify legal descriptions of the orchard. One letter alluded to an unrecorded conversation with someone in the planning department, who had confided that particular council members were habitually looking for ways to claim farmland under false pretenses of community development. Several references to the orchard's distinctive ecosystem stood out among the notes. Finch described pockets of wetlands and habitats for migrating birds, elements that must be preserved at all costs. He even recounted one instance in which a preliminary building permit had been revoked after an environmental agency discovered that the orchard served as a corridor for protected species. The caretaker had been proud of the orchard's resilience, both legally and naturally. If these references aligned with the orchard's trust documents, they might further demonstrate that any major building project required thorough, transparent reviews. After he finished reading the contents, Esther gathered them back into the envelope, hesitating only briefly before allowing him to make photocopies at a nearby machine. He thanked her for risking involvement and promised that, if these letters proved decisive, they would help preserve the orchard's legacy. She responded softly that Finch had poured so much of his life into protecting that land, and it pained her to see the orchard story end with a sprawling concrete edifice. Though her role in the orchard's daily life was limited, she knew enough of Finch's integrity to trust that his records told the truth about the orchard's rightful standing. He drove away with the copies safely tucked in a case on the passenger seat, reflecting on how each new find added one more layer to a growing mosaic. The orchard had defenders, living and dead, who recognized its worth beyond simple monetary figures. The council's narrative of modernization and economic expansion looked increasingly flimsy when held up against decades of methodical record-keeping by individuals who understood that farmland, once lost, could not so easily be reclaimed. In the days that followed, his phone buzzed with sporadic updates. One message came from the environmental law group, acknowledging receipt of his voicemail and inviting him to send more detailed documentation. Another came from a journalist at a small alternative weekly paper, expressing interest in the orchard's plight and asking whether anyone would be willing to speak on the record. He recognized that going public in a newspaper might provoke the council's direct response, but it could also rally citizens who still cared about the orchard's heritage. While considering that press inquiry, he also followed up on the cryptic note that had been slipped under his motel room door. The phone number was real, and a soft-spoken individual on the other end explained that they had once handled clerical tasks for a senior council official. They insisted that knowledge of the orchard's questionable reclassification was widespread among the council's inner circle, and that certain individuals were uneasy about the potential legal fallout. This person claimed to have seen emails and memos alluding to backroom deals with a local real estate consortium, plus an arrangement with certain members of the County Planning Commission who granted expedited permits without full scrutiny. It was, of course, hearsay without physical proof, but the inside source indicated that these documents could be retrieved if one knew where to look. They warned him to be cautious, as the council's leadership would not react kindly to anyone distributing such evidence. He ended the call feeling more certain than ever that a deeper corruption underpinned the orchard's predicament. If he could locate these internal communications, they would serve as a powerful bulwark against any legal maneuver the council attempted. He had seen enough local controversies to know that once the specter of corruption emerged, officials involved often rushed to cover their tracks or deflect blame. But if the orchard's defenders already possessed the trust documents, environmental data, caretaker notes, and now the possibility of incriminating emails, they might finally have the council on the defensive. He returned to the orchard in the late afternoon, the warm light slanting across the torn-up fields. The newly erected fence barred him from entering the central construction area, but he took more photos from outside. The main structure appeared to have gained an additional floor. Reinforced concrete slabs suggested the beginnings of what could be a conference hall or banquet area. A flurry of activity on the second level indicated that workers were installing preliminary electrical lines. Vehicles came and went, bringing drywall, insulation, and rebar. He wondered how many local residents actually understood that this structure was encroaching on farmland once recognized as ecologically significant. Perhaps they saw only the promise of a new hotel or spa, not the cost in terms of lost heritage and disrupted habitats. He noticed a stack of PVC piping leaning against the fence, presumably for further drainage work. The orchard's natural water channels had already been diverted. When the next heavy rain arrived, it could very well lead to unexpected flooding or pooling in areas that had remained stable for generations. He found himself wondering if the orchard's unique microclimate would be altered so severely that the ancient fruit trees still standing might wither. That thought, more than anything, made his resolve flare. This was not solely a battle about who owned land on paper, it was a fight for the orchard's living landscape. Deciding to push forward with a public appeal, he contacted the journalist from the Alternative Weekly, leaving a detailed message describing the orchard's significance and the anomalies surrounding the council's approval process. He added that if the paper wanted, he could provide copies of documents showing environmental red flags and questionable changes to property lines. He did not name individuals, hoping to keep the door open for more concrete revelations once he had actual communications from the council's insiders. The journalist responded later that evening, eager to set up a meeting. They suggested a casual place downtown, away from the council's headquarters, to talk through the orchard story in person. The following day, he found himself seated at a modest cafe, a spiral notebook resting on the table in front of him. The journalist arrived, introduced themselves, and opened a laptop, ready to record. He spoke in broad, measured terms, painting a picture of the orchard's long history, the caretaker's devotion, and the suspicious acceleration of a major hospitality development with apparent disregard for regulations. He emphasized that the orchard was likely protected by a layered trust, and that multiple generations of records contradicted the council's claim that the land was neglected and ripe for commercial takeover. Throughout his remarks, the journalist typed notes, occasionally pressing for more specifics. He held back from revealing the entire trove of caretaker letters and genealogical data but did show a few scanned pages of the orchard's trust text. By the end of the conversation, the journalist seemed intrigued enough to consider pitching a feature article. However, they were clear about one thing: to run such a story with full conviction, the publication would need stronger evidence of wrongdoing, preferably official documents or statements confirming the council's impropriety, rather than mere rumors. He promised to supply more information once he had verified it. With that, they parted, leaving the orchard's advocate thinking again about the inside source who had mentioned incriminating council memos. Locating them might be the key to bringing all these threads into a cohesive narrative powerful enough to sway public opinion and legal scrutiny. That evening, a phone call came from the environmental law group, requesting copies of the orchard's relevant trust documents and any records of prior attempts to develop the land. He spent hours scanning and organizing the caretaker's notes, the genealogical references, and the environmental reviews. He attached them to a carefully worded email and sent it off, as if releasing a bird from a cage, hoping it would find an audience capable of acting decisively. The law group responded with a polite note confirming receipt and requesting patience while they reviewed the material. In the early morning, just as the sun was touching the horizon, he decided to drive out to a ridge overlooking the orchard, a vantage point that provided a wide view without requiring entry onto the fenced-off property. He climbed a short trail through scrubby brush until he reached a clearing. The orchard below sprawled in partial ruin, with large swaths of uprooted soil giving way to rigid steel frames and concrete pillars. Trees that had once formed an unbroken canopy over rolling acres now stood isolated, as though marooned on islands of green amidst a sea of construction debris. Yet, even in this half-dismantled state, the orchard retained a certain dignity. The slope of the land, the pattern of sunlight on the foliage, and the occasional chirp of birds reminded him that nature still held a claim here. He remained for over an hour on that ridge, contemplating what it would take to force a halt to the project. A temporary injunction could buy time for a full legal review, but only if the environmental agencies or a court recognized the weight of the orchard's protective covenants. Public outcry, bolstered by any evidence of corruption, might be enough to spur formal investigations. He realized that the orchard's fate hung in a delicate balance, subject to the interplay of law, politics, and media perception. Yet the orchard's deeper worth stemmed from its identity as a repository of local heritage and ecological stewardship. That intangible value, so difficult to quantify, was precisely what Finch, his grandfather, and other defenders had sought to preserve. Descending the trail, he returned to the roads leading back into town. A message beeped on his phone from the same unknown number as before, the insider who had claimed to know the council's secrets. The text read simply that certain files might be accessible in the county building if he knew which office to search, though no further details were provided. This cryptic hint left him uncertain of how to proceed. Breaking into a locked office or rummaging without proper authorization was not something he wished to risk. Perhaps a formal request under the Freedom of Information Act might yield these files, but if the council had buried them under some classification, or if they never officially existed, that route might be fruitless. Still, the text confirmed that the insider believed documentary proof was out there. He spent the next week filing multiple information requests with various county departments, citing the orchard's legal conflicts and specifying the type of communications he sought: emails between council members regarding Pinebrook Acres, any memos about environmental exemptions, and drafts of project proposals that diverged from the final permits. While waiting for any response, he continued to gather photographic evidence of the ongoing construction damage. The orchard's trust documents, caretaker letters, and genealogical references had been shared with the law group, so he held on to the hope that something within that trove would ignite quick legal action. Now and then, he slipped by the orchard perimeter at twilight, when the machinery lay idle, to observe the site in calmer moments. It was during one such dusk visit that he realized entire rows of orchard trees had been cut down since he last checked. The stumps formed a jagged line, and the sweet scent of cut wood hung in the air. He recognized some of those rows from family photographs, rows that had once yielded an almost legendary harvest. He felt a wave of fury sweep over him. The orchard was being sacrificed at a rapid pace, as if those in charge of construction knew that any day now, they might be challenged to stop. In the midst of this tension, a surprising development occurred. A local philanthropic group with interests in preserving heirloom plant varieties reached out, explaining that they had seen references to Pinebrook Acres in an old horticultural journal. They wondered if the orchard still housed rare apple cultivars. He responded that it did, or at least it once had, but that many of the trees were in danger of being uprooted or destroyed. The group proposed sending a small research team to examine any surviving orchard segments, collecting grafts or seeds if possible, to ensure the genetic lineage did not vanish. Although it was not the direct legal help he craved, their involvement might foster a broader appreciation of what was at stake. He arranged to meet with them on the orchard's outskirts, hoping that once they saw the scale of the project, they might become vocal allies. Meanwhile, the law group finally sent an update, indicating that they had identified a strong basis for contesting the council's permit on environmental grounds, particularly if the orchard's wetlands or protected habitats had been documented. They also believed the orchard's trust covenants, if properly recorded and still valid, might override county-level reclassification. They were tentatively willing to file a motion to pause construction, pending further investigation, but their ability to do so depended on clarifying the orchard's chain of inheritance. This meant verifying his legitimate standing as an heir or trustee to the property. He had expected this hitch, recalling the labyrinth of genealogical records pointing to multiple potential beneficiaries. Yet, if he could demonstrate that none of the orchard's rightful heirs had consented to the project, a strong argument could be made that the council had illegally seized authority. He forwarded all relevant genealogical findings to the law group, including the partial references to distant cousins. He suspected that somewhere along the line, one or two might have been pressured or deceived into signing documents. If so, that partial consent could complicate the orchard's case. But the caretaker's notes emphasized that major changes required unanimous agreement, which had definitely not been obtained. The orchard's champion hoped the law group would interpret these stipulations as a guarantee that no one else could have lawfully granted the council permission to build. In the quiet moments of this frantic period, he reflected on how the orchard's identity had survived through multiple generations of stewardship. Laws and codes might shift, local boards might come and go, but the orchard had persisted largely because of the unwavering diligence of those who cared for it. Though he himself had been absent for a portion of its timeline, he now felt inseparable from its fate. Every piece of evidence, every letter or photograph, felt like a personal testament to the orchard's life force, something that had endured storms, blight, and economic downturns. That endurance made the present threat from the council's bulldozers and cranes seem both tragic and disturbingly mundane, another story of large-scale developers swallowing up family land. Late one night, just as he was about to lock up the documents, his phone rang. The insider, evidently nervous, whispered that certain paper trails existed confirming that the council had arranged for a key county official to overlook the orchard's special status. According to this tipster, the official's office had accepted mislabeled forms about the orchard's land condition, effectively bypassing the trust's constraints. The tipster offered a suggestion to check records from a particular date range, hinting that the relevant files had been improperly filed under a generic heading. After the call ended, he sat for a long moment with pen in hand, scribbling the insider's cryptic advice. If this lead panned out, it might prove beyond a doubt that the council manipulated the orchard's classification from the outset. At dawn, he set out to check the indicated date range in the main county records repository. After some initial runaround, he located a dusty binder of meeting minutes, departmental logs, and attachments that did not appear in the official digitized index. Near the back of that binder, he found a set of forms describing an inspection of abandoned farmland, slated for community revitalization. The signature lines bore the names of council members he recognized, including the infamous Francine Delgado figure, though the orchard's official name was nowhere in the text. Instead, it listed approximate acreage and a location suspiciously close to Pine Brook Acres but omitted any mention of existing structures, orchard trees, or wetlands. In short, it treated the land as a barren lot. A single note at the bottom mentioned a variance recommended for expedited development, with no further explanation. He double-checked the parcel identification number against the orchard's official number. It matched exactly. This discovery confirmed that the council had misrepresented the orchard as vacant land, presumably to dodge the exhaustive requirements that would have arisen if they admitted it was a functioning, ecologically protected farm. Carefully copying each relevant page, he felt a surge of triumph, but also anger. The orchard had been reduced to the status of an empty canvas for commercial interests, and county officials complicit in the deception had allowed the so-called revitalization plan to go forward. He forwarded these scans to the environmental law group, attaching a note explaining their significance. If the orchard was proven to be misclassified at the earliest stages, the entire chain of permits might be invalid. In reply, one of the attorneys wrote that this development could be a game-changer. They were prepared to draft an urgent injunction request, citing fraudulent misrepresentation and potential violations of environmental law. The attorney advised him to be ready for a swift counterattack from the council once they realized the orchard's defenders had secured strong documentary proof. That same afternoon, he met the philanthropic horticultural group at the orchard's perimeter, near the newly installed fence. They expressed shock at the scale of deforestation and land clearing. Although they managed to examine a few surviving trees and gather seeds from the orchard's heirloom varieties, they lamented the destruction of what could have been a living genetic archive. Still, they pledged to circulate news of the orchard's plight among their network, possibly drawing further support. He thanked them, feeling some comfort that even if the orchard could not be saved in its entirety, its genetic heritage might find sanctuary in other fields. Within a day, the law group confirmed they had filed an emergency motion with the county court, requesting an immediate halt to all construction activities at the orchard. The motion cited the orchard's trust protections, the lack of required environmental assessments, and the newly discovered evidence of deliberate misclassification. They sent him a copy of the filing, a lengthy document packed with legal references and appended exhibits, including caretaker notes and the genealogical trust declarations. Reading through it, he felt relief that professional advocates were now championing the orchard's cause in a formal legal venue. News of the filing quickly reverberated through the local community. The alternative weekly publication ran a short piece about the orchard's contested future, noting that an injunction could freeze the ambitious hospitality complex. The piece quoted unnamed sources suggesting corruption in the county's planning process, though it stopped short of naming individuals. Online forums lit up with debates, some praising the orchard's defenders, others claiming this was an anti-progress stunt that would harm local job growth. He took a deep breath, understanding that public opinion might be split, but at least the orchard story was no longer hidden in dusty filing cabinets. It did not take long for a formal response from the council's lawyers to appear. Their statement insisted that everything was above board, that the orchard had indeed been abandoned, and that the trust covenants were outdated if not outright expired. They argued that any reference to wetlands was exaggerated and that the orchard's defenders were clinging to nostalgia instead of recognizing the potential benefits of a modern hospitality hub. The statement ended with a promise to fight any injunction or environmental claim vigorously. Now that the conflict was moving into a legal arena, he readied himself for a new level of intensity. Court schedules, motions, and the potential for depositions loomed on the horizon. The orchard's caretakers' letters, genealogical data, and trust documents were no longer just personal records, they had become critical exhibits in a lawsuit that might reshape the orchard's destiny. Above all, he hoped the presiding judge would see the larger context, that the orchard was not some random parcel, but a unique place whose ties to history, ecology, and community deserved robust protection. He clung to the knowledge that, despite the council's bravado, their original permits stood on shaky ground if the orchard had indeed been wrongly classified. In prior land use conflicts, once any sign of misrepresentation was proven, courts often erred on the side of halting construction until the matter was resolved. But there was no guarantee here, and the council's determination to proceed was evident in the near-complete structural framework dominating the orchard's skyline. He also knew that a final resolution could take months, if not years, unless the judge imposed an immediate work stoppage. In the midst of this uncertainty, he received a phone call from someone identifying themselves as a staffer for a state legislator whose district included Fletcher County. The staffer had seen the recent press coverage and wanted to confirm the orchard's environmental significance. If the orchard's defenders could demonstrate that it indeed contained protected wetlands or threatened species, the legislator might champion an official inquiry. Although he recognized this could be more political theater than genuine concern, he agreed to gather as much environmental data as possible to share with the staffer. Any pressure from higher levels of government might tip the scales, forcing the council to halt the project or, at the very least, justify their actions in a more public forum. Rallying the orchard supporters and sifting through documents for the law group became his full-time occupation. Each day, he navigated swirling rumors that the council was seeking a settlement offer, or that they intended to file a countersuit for defamation. The orchard's champion refused to be rattled. He had spent too many hours hunched over caretaker records, verifying genealogical lines, photographing eroded gullies, and reading reams of outdated county codes. He believed in the orchard's resilience and in the power of truth to topple even the most entrenched bureaucratic schemes. Then, one evening, a sharp rap sounded on his motel door. He opened it warily to find a courier holding an envelope stamped with official seals. Inside was a notice that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled in 2 weeks before a county judge to consider the emergency injunction. Though part of him felt dread at the looming legal confrontation, a greater part felt gratitude that the orchard's cause was finally receiving its day in court. This hearing could either secure a much-needed pause in construction or let the council barrel forward. He recognized that the orchard's survival might hinge on how persuasively the law group and the orchard's advocates could convey the land's unique importance. Locking the door behind him, he sank into the motel chair, rereading the notice. The next 2 weeks promised a whirlwind of preparation, strategy sessions with the attorneys, and outreach to anyone who could validate the orchard's environmental and historical claims. He summoned the memory of the orchard's caretaker and his grandfather, recalling the pride they had taken in safeguarding a patch of earth that bore fruit for generations. He knew that, win or lose, it was his duty to stand firm, to speak for the orchard's silent rows of trees, the delicate wetlands, and the intangible heritage braided into every branch. Whether the council realized it or not, Pinebrook Acres was more than an old farm. It was a living testament to the land's resilience and the human bond with nature, and it deserved every measure of defense he could muster. He stood by the motel window, gazing out at the darkening sky streaked with the last rays of evening light. The envelope containing the official hearing notice lay on the small table nearby. He had reread it until the words blurred. A date now loomed, 2 weeks away, when the orchard's defenders would stand before a county judge to argue that Pinebrook Acres required an immediate halt to development. Beyond the tension he felt, there was a faint thrill of relief. After so many days spent uncovering misfiled records, caretakers' letters, and genealogical charts, the orchard story would finally be heard in a formal setting. That night, he hardly slept. Documents cluttered the motel desk, displaying references to the orchard's trust arrangement, older maps pinpointing wetland boundaries, and caretaker notes describing the orchard's delicate ecosystems. Folders stuffed with evidence threatened to overtake every flat surface. He had begun to consider moving these materials into storage for safety. The orchard's precarious condition weighed on his mind as he thought of the fences and construction equipment that continued to swallow more acreage each day. But the hearing date kindled hope that the orchard might still be spared total ruin. His early morning routine began as usual, with coffee brewed in the small motel kitchenette and a quick check of messages. The law group had left a brief note, requesting another conference call to refine arguments for the injunction. There was also a short message from the horticultural collective that had gathered seeds at the orchard's perimeter, affirming their commitment to preserving any heirloom varieties they salvaged. Lastly, a county official's automated email explained that several of his public records requests were still being processed, though the official gave no estimate of when the search might finish. He suspected that these delays were no coincidence. He responded systematically, confirming his availability for the attorney's call, thanking the horticultural group for their continued efforts, and politely urging the county official to expedite the record searches. Each message reminded him how entwined his life had become with Pinebrook Acres and its uncertain future. He left the motel for a morning drive, his first stop being the orchard itself. He wanted to see if there had been any modifications overnight, if the council's workers had pressed forward under cover of darkness. Upon arrival, he parked far from the main gate, which now sported fresh signage threatening legal action against trespassers. From his vantage point near a low rise, he studied the orchard's panorama. The building framework appeared unchanged, though there were new pallets of construction materials stacked in rows near a newly paved area. Temporary lights on tall poles ringed the site, indicating that the council might have shifted to late-night work schedules, maximizing progress before the hearing could halt their momentum. The orchard's trees seemed to shrink against the looming structures, many of them now bulldozed except for the still forested corner that remained, albeit precariously. He took notes on everything: the new lights, the extended pavement, the piling of additional materials, and any further evidence of ground disturbance. He saw no sign of large crews yet, perhaps they arrived later in the day. The metallic scaffolding glinted coldly in the morning sun. It stood in stark contrast to the orchard's older, gentler aesthetics, as though imposing a foreign geometry on land once governed by nature's quiet rhythms. One or two crows perched on a twisted fence post, cawing intermittently, as though unsettled by the transformation below. After documenting these changes, he drove on to a small industrial park near Fletcher County's border, where the law group had arranged for temporary workspace to organize their case. They had rented a modest conference room, outfitted with a few folding tables, portable scanners, and laptops. In the hallway, he found two of the attorneys in conversation over a set of legal briefs. They motioned him inside, and he spread out the orchard's materials that he had transported in heavy canvas bags. The attorneys had begun assembling a narrative that would be as succinct as possible for the court's consideration. They explained, in measured tones, that they wanted to present a clear, threefold argument. First, that the orchard was subject to a trust that invalidated unilateral reclassification. Second, that wetlands and sensitive habitats had been compromised without legal review. And third, that the council's project was compromised by evidence of misclassification, possibly crossing into fraudulent territory. He listened, nodding at each point. In turn, he reminded the attorneys that caretaker Finch's notes documented earlier attempts to tamper with the orchard's boundaries. He had discovered older communications indicating that certain officials were aware of the orchard's significance but had deliberately underplayed it. He emphasized that the orchard had never been an abandoned property. Its rows might have grown wild in places after his family's absence, but the orchard retained functioning irrigation systems, well-maintained soils, and living heirs who never relinquished ownership. The attorneys assured him they would integrate those details into the legal argument, painting a portrait of willful neglect by the council. They then reviewed the hearing procedure, explaining that the judge would likely ask probing questions about the orchard's lineage, who held current ownership interests, and what evidence tied the orchard's boundaries to protected land. The attorneys warned that the council's representatives would almost certainly argue that the orchard's trust documents were out of date, or that the orchard's caretaker misapplied those protections by failing to register updates. It was vital, they said, to demonstrate continuity. Every time changes had been made to the orchard's trust, they were done so in compliance with relevant statutes, meaning the orchard's conservation status remained in force. Leaving that meeting, he felt the daunting weight of a complex legal fight, yet the attorneys seemed ready, and that gave him cautious confidence. Before heading back to the motel, he dropped by Fletcher County's largest print shop, where he had arranged for large-format reproductions of the orchard's historical maps. He collected the rolled prints carefully, verifying that boundary lines and references to watercourses appeared in crisp detail. These visual aids might be indispensable in court, especially if they helped the judge grasp how the orchard's layout clashed with the council's claim that the property was barren. At the motel, he discovered a voicemail from the journalist at the alternative weekly publication. The voice sounded urgent, indicating that a few more leads had surfaced about suspicious rezoning efforts tied to other properties in the county. The orchard case might be part of a broader pattern, potentially implicating multiple officials who had bypassed environmental and trust-related restrictions. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, pondering the ramifications. If the orchard's case was merely one of several, the journalist might be preparing an exposé that could put local officials on the defensive. This exposure might either strengthen the orchard's position or provoke an aggressive backlash from those who felt threatened. For the next few days, he lived in a state of near-constant motion. Mornings at the orchard or at the law group's rented workspace, afternoons on calls with environmental agencies or genealogical experts, and evenings organizing the stacks of scanned documents. On one such evening, as he sorted caretaker Finch's letters by date, he found a curious reference to something called the Third Covenant, a phrase underlined in red ink. The letter described how, back in the orchard's earlier days, a special addendum had been added to the trust, specifically addressing the orchard's water resources and soil composition. Finch wrote that this covenant, if invoked, could trigger an automatic reevaluation by the State Environmental Office. He had never noticed the mention of this Third Covenant before, perhaps because it was buried in the middle of a long, meandering letter. He scoured his remaining files in search of any official document bearing that title but came up empty. It was possible the caretaker had recognized the orchard's ecological vulnerability and wanted an additional safeguard. Yet, if the caretaker never filed it with the county, the addendum might lack legal force. He made a note to mention it to the attorneys. Even if it was merely a conceptual plan that never reached formal status, it might help illustrate how meticulously the orchard's protectors had considered its future. While flipping through more letters, he began thinking about the caretaker's final years. Very little in the orchard's records described how Finch's role ended. Perhaps some crucial piece of the orchard's timeline had slipped away with that caretaker's passing. He recalled the woman named Esther who had shared letters. She might not have known the orchard's entire legal history, but she was connected enough to Finch to glean some knowledge of how the caretaker's stewardship ended. He made a mental note to follow up with her again, hoping for any clue that might lead to the missing puzzle pieces. The next morning, he found an envelope slipped under his door. Its contents were a typed letter from the same unidentified insider who had previously texted him. The letter alleged that certain council members had grown nervous about the orchard's trust documents. They had begun meeting informally with county planners, discussing strategies to expedite construction before a potential court order could freeze the project. Supposedly, these informal sessions involved reassigning workers to complete the orchard's interior as quickly as possible, thereby making any shutdown more difficult to enforce. There were also rumors of nighttime deliveries of heavy equipment to accelerate site preparation for a parking structure. The orchard's champion read each line slowly, absorbing the sense of near panic that seemed to grip the council's leadership. The letter closed with a warning: those who had orchestrated the orchard's takeover would not hesitate to cast blame on whichever subordinates they could if legal scrutiny intensified. He spent the rest of the morning patrolling the orchard's perimeter, verifying some of what the insider had indicated. There were indeed new tire tracks in the soft ground, fresh enough to suggest late-night deliveries of materials. Portable floodlights at the site's far corner hinted that crews might be working extended hours. He captured photos and brief video clips on his phone, making sure to record date and time stamps. If the orchard's defenders secured a court order, these visuals might show that the council had tried to push construction past a point of no return in defiance of legal norms. That afternoon, the attorneys convened a remote briefing with him, running through potential lines of questioning they might face in court. He prepared to describe the orchard's genealogical lineage, summarizing how the trust had been updated over generations, and how caretaker Finch's records linked each iteration of the orchard's boundaries and ecological practices. The attorneys also wanted him to be ready to answer criticisms about the orchard's condition. The council's representatives would likely argue that images of overgrown trees or areas of the orchard not currently in active production proved it was derelict. Yet, as the attorneys stressed, farmland could lie fallow without being legally abandoned, especially in a place managed for ecological diversity rather than single-crop yields. In between these rehearsals, he checked on the horticultural group's progress. They had managed to catalog several types of fruit trees that might be unique to Pinebrook Acres, although they were concerned that many cultivars could be destroyed before any meaningful research could be concluded. They remained hopeful that a court order would at least allow them more time to extract seeds and graft cuttings for safekeeping. He promised to keep them updated, recognizing how vital it was to preserve the orchard's botanical heritage, especially if the council persisted in treating the trees as obstacles rather than living specimens. As the hearing date approached, local rumors swirled. Some citizens in Fletcher County voiced support for the orchard, recalling childhood visits or describing it as a local treasure. Others criticized the orchard's defenders for allegedly hindering economic growth, repeating the council's talking points that the new hotel would generate jobs, tourism, and tax revenue. A few editorial letters in the county newspaper mentioned how farmland in the region was increasingly difficult to maintain, implying that commercial redevelopment might be the only viable option. He read these letters with a heavy heart. They underscored just how vulnerable places like Pinebrook Acres could be when growth-minded agendas overpowered nuanced conversations about heritage and conservation. Still, hope arrived in the form of an email from the State Environmental Office, acknowledging receipt of the orchard's complaint and stating that they intended to conduct a preliminary site visit. Although no date was specified, the fact that the office had taken notice boded well. He forwarded this message to the attorneys, who promptly folded it into their arguments about the orchard's pending status. If state officials arrived and found wetlands or sensitive habitats in jeopardy, it would add weight to the request for an injunction. He passed the days before the hearing engaged in a final push for information. He pressed the county clerk's office for updates on any old property tax records or caretaker correspondences they might still hold. He left another message for Esther, hoping she might recall additional details about the orchard's trust. He also combed through caretaker Finch's diaries once more, searching for mention of a bound volume that might contain the elusive Third Covenant. These diaries were a patchwork of daily accounts, weather patterns, orchard tasks, the caretaker's reflections on community politics, but no single entry spelled out the covenant's whereabouts. He wondered if Finch had entrusted it to a bank vault or a family lawyer, or perhaps simply never put it to paper beyond scribbled notes. At last, the day of the hearing arrived. He drove to the county courthouse early, feeling an uneasy swirl of anticipation. The attorneys had requested that he be present, prepared to answer any factual questions about the orchard's history. The stately building, with its tall columns and worn stone steps, loomed before him like a gate to an uncertain future. Inside, the corridors were lined with benches where nervous people waited for small claims disputes or traffic violations to be called. By contrast, the orchard's issue felt monumental, an entire landscape at stake, plus broader questions about corruption and exploitation of local land use policies. He found the attorneys in a corridor outside a small hearing room, flipping through thick binders. They acknowledged him with calm nods but had no time for lengthy conversation. The council's legal representatives arrived soon after, bearing stern expressions and bulging folders presumably aimed at dismissing the orchard's trust documents as relics of a bygone era. The tension between the two groups was palpable, though no words were exchanged. When the door opened and everyone filed in, the room was smaller than expected, furnished with plain wooden tables and a bench where the judge would preside. A worn county seal hung on the back wall. The judge entered, took a seat, and began the session by summarizing the basic contours of the case. Pinebrook Acres, a historic orchard, was subject to an emergency motion requesting an immediate halt to development by the Fletcher Cooperative Council, which claimed it had legally acquired the right to build a hospitality complex. The attorneys for the orchard laid out the essential arguments, referencing the trust documents, caretaker Finch's notes, genealogical charts, and environmental studies. They reiterated that the orchard was misclassified in official filings, and that the trust explicitly forbade major structural changes without unanimous consent from designated heirs. In response, the council's legal team insisted that the orchard had long been out of productive use, that no living heirs had expressed an interest until the council took action, and that any references to wetlands or ecological significance were exaggerated or outdated. They repeated that the orchard's trust, if it ever existed in valid form, did not reflect modern property conditions. They also suggested that the orchard's defenders were sentimental obstructionists who had no concrete plans to restore the land, thus depriving the community of economic benefits. Throughout these remarks, the orchard's champion sat silently behind the attorneys, heart pounding. He had encountered many of the council's talking points in editorials and rumors. Hearing them directed at a judge, however, brought a different gravity. He took some comfort in noticing that the judge seemed intent on reading the orchard's submitted documents rather than simply accepting the council's word. Partway through the session, the judge requested clarifications about the orchard's boundary surveys and trust renewal dates. One of the orchard's attorneys brought forward the large-format maps he had retrieved, unrolling them carefully to show how the orchard's layout contradicted the vacant acreage narrative. The council's representatives maintained their argument, pointing to photographs of brush-filled sections of land as if to prove the orchard was a neglected eyesore. Yet, the orchard's legal team countered with caretaker Finch's meticulous notes, describing cyclical rest periods for certain plots, along with water channel maintenance logs. Even in the orchard's quiet phases, it had never been forsaken. The orchard's attorneys also pointed out how suspicious it was that the council's initial filings omitted the orchard's existing irrigation lines and orchard rows, as though they had never existed. By midday, after a series of pointed questions, the judge concluded that a decision on an immediate injunction required further consideration. The judge noted that both sides presented conflicting documentation, particularly about whether the orchard's trust was legally binding. Additionally, the judge indicated an interest in verifying the orchard's environmental status, hinting that if wetlands or other sensitive habitats existed, the council's project might indeed be in violation of state regulations. The judge set a short timeline for additional filings, no more than 10 days, before issuing a ruling on whether to freeze construction. Although the orchard's defenders had hoped for a quicker outcome, the attorneys whispered that this was not unexpected. The mere fact that the judge wanted more time to review the orchard's trust documents and ecological concerns signaled that the orchard's motion had not been dismissed outright. Once outside, the council's team departed quickly, refusing to speak to reporters who had gathered in the hallway. The orchard's attorneys exhaled, murmuring that it was now essential to gather any outstanding evidence, especially about the orchard's wetlands or species habitats, and to refine genealogical proofs showing undisputed continuity of trust ownership. Even a partial pause in construction might come if the judge perceived a strong enough likelihood that the council had sidestepped legal obligations. That same afternoon, the attorneys urged the orchard's champion to redouble efforts in contacting genealogical experts and environmental organizations. The judge's interest in environmental harm was a promising angle, but it had to be supported by robust evidence. If the orchard contained unique wetlands, a thorough environmental survey might tip the scale. In the next breath, they also warned him that the council might intensify site work over the next 10 days to transform any injunction into a moot point if the structures were largely complete. This possibility weighed on him. The orchard could be beyond saving if the council managed to seal off crucial areas or finalize major installations. In the following days, he noticed an uptick in nighttime activity at the orchard site. The sounds of machinery rumbled well past dusk, and bright work lights illuminated the half-finished buildings. He documented the situation from the ridge above the orchard, capturing time-stamped photographs that he forwarded to the attorneys. Meanwhile, he reached out to the state environmental office again, emphasizing that a prompt site visit could be decisive. The official who responded repeated that the office planned to inspect the orchard, but the timeframe remained vague. While tension mounted over the orchard's fate, a spark of hope arrived from an unexpected quarter. A longtime Fletcher County resident contacted him after reading the weekly paper's coverage. This individual claimed to have grown up working alongside caretaker Finch and believed that somewhere in Finch's personal effects lay a fully executed addendum to the orchard's trust, the very one Finch had called the Third Covenant. If this was accurate, it might force the court to recognize a further layer of protection for Pinebrook Acres. He pressed for details, but the resident only recounted that Finch had mentioned stashing something important in a bank safe deposit box. They did not know which bank or the precise nature of the document. He contacted Esther again, only to find that she remained unsure where Finch might have archived the orchard's final trust papers. She speculated that they could have been in a deposit box that Finch stopped paying for at some point. If so, the bank might have eventually surrendered its contents to the state's unclaimed property division. Realizing time was short, he arranged to file a request with the state's unclaimed property office, citing caretaker Finch's name and the orchard's. He had no guarantee they would find anything, but he could not ignore even a faint possibility that this third covenant still existed in a formal, notarized format. Simultaneously, the orchard's attorneys pressed ahead with the genealogical angle, contacting distant relatives whose names appeared in the trust's lineage. A couple of them proved elusive, others expressed vague support for protecting the orchard, though they had little time or interest in traveling to Fletcher County. The attorneys assured these relatives that the orchard's fate hung on establishing that no rightful heir had approved the council's development project. If even one heir had inadvertently signed something that the council used to claim permission, it might complicate the case. So far, it appeared no such agreement existed. The orchard's champion recognized that his own diligence in verifying these details formed a crucial line of defense against the council's narrative. Despite these efforts, the frantic pace of construction escalated daily. Several times he drove by at dawn to see new scaffolding, new segments of wall, and newly delivered materials. In certain places, entire sections of the orchard's old fruit rows now resembled a vast parking lot foundation. Each fresh sign of progress hit him like a blow, intensifying his anxiety. Even if they won the motion to halt further building, the orchard would already be dramatically altered. Yet, as the attorneys reminded him, preserving the orchard's future did not necessarily require reversing every inch of structural intrusion. A court could mandate partial dismantling or impose steep penalties that forced the council to abandon the project. There was precedent for that in other counties, though it remained far from guaranteed. With the judge's deadline for additional filings looming, the orchard's legal team compiled every new piece of evidence. They appended caretaker Finch's letters, genealogical attestations from out-of-state relatives, and updated photos documenting the orchard's environmental features. They also included statements from the horticultural group about the orchard's unique cultivars. Finally, in a concluding section, they reminded the court that the orchard's classification as vacant acreage had been proven false by county records the orchard's champion had unearthed. The council's misrepresentations, they argued, were not minor technical oversights but pointed to a deliberate scheme to circumvent the orchard's trust-based protections. Late one evening, he received a brief but thrilling message from the State Environmental Office. A field agent had been assigned to perform an on-site inspection within the next 48 hours. The office requested that a property representative be present to guide them to areas of ecological concern. He immediately contacted the attorneys, who saw this as a perfect chance to show that the orchard contained water channels and habitats deserving of legal protection. Still, the orchard was fenced off, and the council might attempt to deny entry. Since the orchard's champion was the rightful heir, he believed he had standing to grant access, although the council's armed security presence, if any, could complicate matters. The attorneys prepared a letter affirming that the orchard's champion retained ownership rights that allowed him to escort officials onto the land. On the appointed day, he arrived early at the orchard gate, joined by the field agent from the environmental office, a quiet figure carrying a notepad and a small camera. No security guards blocked their way, but the gate was locked. A short time later, a council representative showed up, demanding to know who had authorized the inspection. The field agent produced credentials, and the orchard's champion presented the attorney's letter. After some haggling, the council representative unlocked the gate, warning them to remain in safe zones and not interfere with active construction. The field agent conducted a systematic walk, photographing drainage ditches, the remains of tree stumps near the orchard's wettest areas, and a couple of small ponds that had formed behind partially built walls. He pointed out the orchard's original water channels that caretaker Finch had diligently maintained, describing how they once supported amphibians and various bird species. The field agent nodded, scribbling notes, asking the occasional clarifying question in a subdued tone. From the agent's solemn reaction, the orchard's champion guessed that the destruction of certain zones might already violate state or federal guidelines, though no official pronouncement was made on site. After finishing the inspection, the agent thanked both sides and left, explaining that a formal report would be filed promptly. He emerged from that experience feeling a guarded hopefulness. The mere existence of an official inspection signaled that the orchard was now under regulatory scrutiny. And any major breaches would not be easy for the council to hush up. Still, the day's real significance lay in how quickly a conclusive assessment would reach the judge. If the agent's findings corroborated the orchard's claims, a court-ordered halt became more likely. The orchard's champion left the property wishing caretaker Finch were alive to see a government representative stepping in where before there had been only quiet defiance and incomplete records. As the final days ticked down, he devoted himself to ensuring all documentation was well organized, from land surveys to genealogical charts. Each morning, he checked for updates from the unclaimed property office, though no discovery of Finch's third covenant had yet emerged. He also received calls from a local news station now curious about the orchard's plight. He spoke carefully, emphasizing that the orchard's defenders were not against progress but believed in transparent, ethical processes that respected farmland trusts and environmental obligations. He recognized that public sentiment could still sway the broader narrative, even as the judge's ruling loomed. On the evening before the judge's scheduled ruling, he lingered at the motel desk, rereading caretaker Finch's final letters. The caretaker wrote about the orchard's future as if it were an unbroken continuum, passing from one generation to the next. Finch had believed that, even if the orchard's rightful owners were absent, the orchard's best interests could outlast any wave of opportunism. Now the orchard's champion hoped that belief would be vindicated in court, establishing once and for all that Pinebrook Acres was not merely a commercial canvas, but a living entity with deep roots in both family legacy and ecological stewardship. He slept fitfully, waking before dawn with a sense of anticipation and dread. If the judge granted an injunction, the orchard's chance at survival increased dramatically. If the motion was denied, the council would almost certainly accelerate construction, turning the orchard into a de facto hotel site too advanced to reverse. Determined to face the outcome with composure, he got dressed, gathered every critical piece of documentation in a weatherproof folder, and drove off in the pre-dawn light toward the courthouse. Clouds stretched across the sky, tinted with the faintest hint of pink, and he wondered whether that subtle glow might portend a rare moment of redemption for a place already scarred by bulldozers. By the time he arrived, the attorneys were waiting at the courthouse steps, their expressions tense but resolved. Today would be the culmination of weeks of frantic searching, cross-referencing, and fact-finding. Reporters hovered around, taking quick notes, while the council's representatives stood apart, conferring in hushed voices. The orchard's champion clutched his folder, recalling caretaker Finch's handwriting, genealogical charts, and the orchard's official deeds, each item a testament to the orchard's rightful story. Whatever the judge decided, these documents would endure as reminders that Pinebrook Acres was more than an abstraction in a county ledger. It was a living tapestry of soil, water, and trees, defended across generations by those unwilling to let it vanish without a fight.